Hello and welcome to the Ghibli Rewatch series of the Overly Animated Podcast, where we'll be going through every Studio Ghibli movie chronologically from the beginning. I'm Dylan Hysen, and today I'm joined by Aly Martin.
Hello.
And April Collins.
Hi there.
Join us in rewatching or watching for the first time all the Studio Ghibli movies now that they're available for streaming for the first time on HBO Max in the United States and Netflix in most of the rest of the world. Asterisk, as of this recording, the movie we're talking about today, Wind Rises, does not have subtitles on the Japanese version on HBO Max, which is very annoying. Hopefully that is fixed by the time you're watching it, but if you're experiencing that, no, it's not you, it's just you. So, yeah. So we'll say on Netflix, it's apparently fine. Okay, that
being
because
said, they used to be there, so hopefully it'll be fixed.
I hope so. We've also had spacing problems in two other movies, so let's get it together.
HBO, get on it.
Yeah. New podcast every Wednesday as we go through the whole Ghibli catalog chronologically at overlyanimated.com. I'm a Ghibli expert joined by co-hosts with a variety of Ghibli experience. As I mentioned, today is The Wind Rises, the final Hayao Miyazaki movie we'll be talking about on this series. Very excited to get into Wind Rises. Full spoilers for every movie we discuss here, except only minor spoilers for the rest of the Ghibli catalog besides Wind Rises. We'll be discussing both the subbed and dubbed versions, primarily the subs, but watch whichever you prefer. Have not seen, I don't think I've seen the dub for this movie, so I'll see if we have comments on the dub.
I watched the dub.
Okay, yay.
And I've seen both.
Because the subtitles for the Japanese were not working.
Yes,
and I was like,
I guess you watched
no
the
choice.
dub. Yeah. Okay,
Listen, this is one of the few times where I'll say the dub is good. It's a good one.
Interesting, that's good. Talk about
good cast,
Joseph
good
Gordon-Levitt.
Interpretations. Yeah.
Okay.
So like a really big name, surprisingly. I mean, well, not surprisingly, but it was kind of unexpected.
The Ghibli, or the Miyazaki ones especially, have had some pretty big names for the dubs. That's good to hear. So we'll discuss that maybe. But yes, let's get into The Wind Rises. This is 2013. Hayao Miyazaki's final feature film until it wasn't, and he decided to once again come out of retirement. But this time they actually shut Studio Ghibli down. So they brought Studio Ghibli back, and now he's in production for How Do You Live, his final,
maybe,
I assume, due out in a few years. It seems like it'll be his final movie. The last one here, Wind Rises, is about real life historical figure Jiro Horikoshi, who designed the Zero fighter plane in Japan. The movie is adapted from Miyazaki's manga of the same name. He wrote that before, was encouraged to make it into a movie. Basically if you're unaware, this movie is like half Jiro's real life based on history and half a 1937 novel, The Wind Has Risen, by Tatsuo Hori, which is about a man taking care of his wife who's in a sanatorium. So basically all the plane stuff is real. All the sick wife stuff is from the book and is kind of stapled onto Jiro's life. Jiro's life, who did not have a wife with tuberculosis. Movie was financially successful, critically well received, as per usual with Miyazaki's movies. So, a lot to talk about, probably some heavy topics we're going to get into, as this is, Miyazaki's most adult film. So we have quite a few different themes to talk about. Aly, what's your history with Wind Rises? What do you think of this movie?
I want to say I watched it when it came out, but I honestly don't remember. I've seen it a couple of times since then. I'm pretty sure I established this on the Poppy Hill pod that I am all about like historical romance dramas, especially if they're very tragic. I guess
this is two in a row for that. Yeah, two in a row.
Yeah.
History romances. Yeah.
I mean, I'm a fan of them. It's hard to say if they're enjoyable or not. I think it was very well done, but I'll say this, like all in all, the movie, as like beautifully well done as it is, makes me uncomfortable for a lot of reasons, like not agreeing with Jiro's choices or lifestyle. I mean, we're going to get into like all the war stuff, but I do enjoy this sort of thing to a degree, especially when it like makes me feel like I have to question my ideas to the point of like where I wind up reading and doing research, ruminating things that I either thought I was super familiar with and turned out to be wrong about, or that I knew like nothing about. So learning about like World War I Japan, obviously I knew some stuff, but like not to the extent about the fighter planes and about the kamikaze stuff. But like, I think it was done in a way that like it makes you just uncomfortable enough, not in a bad way. And we're going to get into that because you have a lot of stuff a lot of notes on it, but I did enjoy it a lot. I think it's one of his really good movies that people don't really talk enough about, especially because of like, I guess it's controversial stuff, but yeah, it's a good movie.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, it is, it is his most recent movie. Hasn't had time to percolate as in terms of like being a classic or anything.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll see where consensus lands on Wind Rises. I do think there's a little bit of a divisive one, which we can get into. April, what about you? What's your history with this movie, and what did you think of it?
So I have like no history with this movie. I think I remember like hearing about it, and I was like, okay, that's cool, and then that was like the end of it. But I guess I like knowing that it was slightly based off of real life, so that's kind of cool. And I do I'm always really like interested in like Japan's history, and so I guess like knowing about like I guess sort of like what led up to World War II is kind of interesting as well. I thought it was very well done, but for me, this movie just moved so slow, and like I hated that it moved slow, but I understand and I get it moving slow, given like what's taking place within the context of the movie and everything like that. But it was like very well done. One of my favorite things was the earthquake scene. I just love how that was animated, even though it was very tragic. But but yeah, I mean I enjoyed it, but it's not one of my most favorite movies. So, and I wasn't like super duper like blown away. There was like some like CG animation that was sort of jarring, but other than that, like it looked good. The music was nice. It was a very like Miyazaki-esque. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, this is the Planes movie, so on its own, it's a very Miyazaki-esque movie. So probably in some ways very reminiscent of his work. Other ways pretty different. Yeah, I agree. The earthquake scene's really good. One of the best in the movie. We can talk about it. It's depicting real life. Yeah, I don't think it's gonna be a big discussion point, so we can mention it now. It's depicting real life earthquake 1923. I think the Great Kanto earthquake. So that's their retelling of that history. I've saw Wind Rises. I've always liked it, but maybe was never in love with it. Was interested to revisit it now. I think this is a gorgeous movie. So basically I have a similar opinion now. I think this movie's good, and I more like respect it necessarily than love it, which I think is some people's thoughts on this.
Yeah.
I do think the romance is very affecting. I'm very interested in the fact that Miyazaki finally depicts like a full romance in his movies, which is like shocking given how prior to his last 3 movies, there's like nobody kisses ever, and then suddenly there's a lot of romance going on. I think the big thing, I find this movie less magical than any previous Miyazaki movie. Every single one of his movies, and I connect to it less personally. So that's just a personal thing. I will say I find the movie morally questionable. We'll get into it, and we'll extensively get into it probably. And I think that's frustrating considering Miyazaki movies usually are like magical and progressive, and that's wonderful. This movie is progressive in some ways, but is also like Miyazaki's least progressive movie in other ways. And more importantly, I guess, though, it's just like off-putting. I think the surrounding context of the movie, like there's a lot of like this. The movie is very sanitized, but if you think about what's happening beyond it, I think a lot of stuff becomes pretty off-putting. So I think it's a little tough to watch in that regard. So it's not like my favorite Miyazaki movie to watch, and I would say it's actually probably my least favorite Miyazaki movie to watch. And I'm not sure where I'm landing on in terms of like best or anything with like maybe it's probably not one of my favorites in terms of ranking or anything, but I do really appreciate it, and I think it's really interesting that we got this movie because it's like a pure adult Miyazaki movie, and like I didn't really ever think we'd get many things about this movie from Miyazaki. Didn't think we'd get a full adult movie. Didn't think we'd get a full romance movie. No fantasy movie. So I'm, even though it's not the one I connect with the most, I think there's a lot to like admire and dig into here. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, although a tough one in terms of some subjects for us to have.
It's definitely easier to appreciate than it is to enjoy.
Yes.
Yeah, and you don't have to like enjoy your favorite, like a great movie. You can like some movies are gritty on purpose, and it's about you're supposed to feel rough things. This is probably Miyazaki's movie that's closest to that, although I don't really know that that's what he's going for here.
I'd say in a way it is, but you have quotes about that we can get into later.
Yeah. I mean, certainly there's a lot of sad stuff happening. It's about going on this experience of Jiro's life, which is not always in a very fun direction. In fact, probably tragic across the board, I would say, ends up being. More subtly in terms of the plain stuff, but so, I mean, there's probably the main topic is going to be like all the stuff about war, because I think it's most interesting to get into. But we could start off by talking about like what I was mentioning, the different genres of the film, because this is a historical film, a first from Miyazaki. It's like he's had movies set in the past, I guess, before, and he wrote the Poppy Hill last movie, which is explicitly set in Japan, older Japan. But it's like a war movie, it's a romance drama, an adult film. And probably most notably, it's not a fantasy movie, which is shocking. I mean, how many non-fantasy movies does Miyazaki have? Like, kind of Kiki? Like, maybe it's a little...
Well, she's a witch. That counts.
She's a witch.
Yeah,
and then Porco Rosso is definitely the closest to this movie, but he's a pig.
Yeah, but he's a pig, and he's under some spell or curse or something. Yeah. So
I think Porco, the biggest difference, like honestly, him being a pig isn't even the biggest difference between Porco and this for me. It is the fact that Porco's like is like a fun romp, and this movie is like a serious, sad drama. So I feel like it's very tonally different. Aly, how do you think Miyazaki handles kind of one of our first experiences with him, like not making a fantasy movie?
Well, it's tough to go into it without bringing up that like controversy thing that we have in our outline. But I think I think he succeeded in making it provocative in terms of stirring up discussion that like people are uncomfortable with having or aren't ready for or don't want to have it. But I'm honestly not sure how well that went in Japan when it came out, because of all the war stuff. Well, not because of that time, but just because in general, Japan and its history with war is very tricky. In terms of his not doing a fantasy movie, I think like April said, it does drag, but I also understand why it drags, because like there's too many things happening at once that have to be, going back and forth and back and forth. I think it is a little tiring, but I wouldn't say it was done poorly. I just think I don't know if you like said that it's hard to watch, but it's like okay, it's being hammered a little too hard, but in a sense it makes sense why he's doing it that way.
Do you think it's, so in terms of if you're someone that finds this maybe the least watchable or the least fun, which, I think clearly this is probably his least fun movie on purpose, is it the lack of fantasy that is the cause of that, or is it that he's just going for that sort of tone?
I think it's both, but if you're going into Miyazaki, you're automatically expecting it to be super like out of this world and not at all about the real life. So I think that it not being a fantasy is more of a factor than it being a war movie, but I think it's definitely both. It has to be both.
Yeah, it's a shocking choice for Miyazaki to make a completely non-fantasy movie here for his last film, because he's explicitly known for his fantastical sequences and his fantasy.
But the thing is, he does have a lot of like super incredible sequences, especially with the dream sequences, that kind of, it doesn't make up for it not being a fantasy, but it does like it keeps that element of his movies in this one. And I mean, also with just the sequences where he's like explaining how the planes are built, the animation and period is just like very provocative. I don't know the word. Like his fantastical element. I'm trying to think of proper wording, but I'm bad at that.
I think like evocative of his what you would feel and for his fantasy sequences normally. And this would bring me to some Napier quotes. But first, like April, do you find Miyazaki retains kind of this sort of fantastical quality that he's known for in this non-fantasy movie?
I mean, like Aly was saying, the closest we get to is sort of those dream sequences, but even those seem very like grounded in reality almost.
Yeah.
Like they're not too like out there like you would sort of hope, like think, I guess, or expect them to be. Which, you know, kind of like again, like it's like the combination of this being like a historical like war movie, like, and that there's almost like no room for fantasy in it. That's it's such a like unique combination for him, because it's not unlike Miyazaki to take on like controversial or like heavy topics, but like for him to do so and then just so like totally remove the element that he's known for when it comes to like animation is just kind of like shocking almost. And I wouldn't say, I mean, it kind of makes it hard to watch, but like, I don't know. It's hard to describe that feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me bring in some quotes from Susan Napier in her book Miyazakiworld, about kind of how there is still potentially fantasy stuff in this non-fantasy movie. First, about kind of the beauty of the movie. She says, "The Wind Rises is a beautiful movie, conveying Miyazakiworld in its distillation of the director's own romantic yearnings, ideological anxieties, and core values, more than it offers historical insight. Although there is no explicit fantasy, the film contains dream sequences and other evocative images that suggest an alternative to the rising militarism, extremes of poverty and wealth, and growing international tensions of 1930s Japan. The Wind Rises revels in its luscious portrayals of Miyazaki's cherished Euro world, the Italian countryside over which a handcrafted airplane swoops and swerves, a memorable view of a gargantuan German aircraft factory with the winter lighting shining in its high windows, but most stunning are the carefully rendered reimaginings of pre-war Japan." Which brings up the setting of the movie and the time period, which we are in. You know, we go from somewhere a little bit before 1920 in Japan to 1937 is kind of where we end up prior to this epilogue, which probably takes place a little bit later. So mostly in like 20s and 30s Japan, interesting earlier time period than we're used to. Although I guess probably adjacent to Porco Rosso, or at least a similar time period. We see we're in Germany in 1929, and then we're like only in Italy, I guess, in fantasy sequences. I guess in terms of this is getting into some of the war subject matter, but it's related to the setting. I mean, the fact that we spend, you know, a significant amount of time in this movie in like pre-Nazi Germany, and we spend time in Japan with the rise of like a fascist like government or something. We see the secret police chasing him. It's just not very fun. Like,
No.
It's just like a lot of not fun stuff. I mean, I feel like being in pre-Nazi Germany, like I'm not appreciating the beauty of the scenes. I'm just uncomfortable. That's kind of my personal reaction to it.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Well, and also, like, those scenes are sort of, like, hostile because, you know, Jiro and I'm not going to say his friend's name right. They... but,
Jiro and his boyfriend.
Honjo,
that's right. I was like, I literally just watched this and I can't remember his name. So Jiro and Honjo, like, all of those scenes are, like, they're hostile. Like, they're just trying to do their jobs, but yet, like, they're being like super restricted. And then there's like the one scene with Honjo and he's so like frustrated and mad and he's like, I need to smoke a cigarette, and then he like just picks up one that's already been like smoked and he's like, this will do it. And then he like throws things and he's like, we're going for a walk, and I'm like, all right. Like,
I will say the original voice actor is also great, but John Krasinski did a great job.
He did
dubbing
such
him.
a great job.
It was very
with
unexpected.
Honjo? Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting.
He did really, really well, like especially with the, frustration about like the economic societal differences between Japan and like other Western countries or whatever. I thought it was done well.
Yes.
Even though they don't have accents, but whatever.
Yeah. How was Castorp in the dub?
Oh my god.
Gosh.
Wait, are you talking about Stanley Tucci?
That makes sense that's Stanley Tucci. If I were to guess who Castorp would be without looking at it, no, that's Caproni is Stanley Tucci.
Oh, my bad.
Okay.
Oh,
Castor was Warner Herzog. That makes more sense. Okay.
Oh.
Stereotypical German guy. Okay, I like it.
That's fine.
That character's funny.
He
but
me out, honestly. Like,
yeah, no, I think he's kind of supposed to be creepy, but he ends
no,
up being
the voice,
sympathetic.
no, the voice was even like put it over the top. I was just like, I'm uncomfortable around you. Can you go away?
I don't think he had that much of an accent in the sub. I don't remember. He's weird, but I don't think he has like a heavy German accent or anything. I agree that the German scenes are like intentionally hostile.
Yeah.
It's going. Yeah. I think this movie's just generally going for an eerie beauty instead of a fun beauty, and it's just very different for Miyazaki.
Yeah, but he does have that theme of like corruption of beauty in all of his movies. This one is just like
this is the corruption of beauty. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's getting into the pre-war Japan setting. Napier has thoughts on that. She says the film's historical setting allows Miyazaki to use his artistry to recreate a lost pre-war Japan. The film's visuals lovingly evoke pre-war architecture and scenery, such as the stunning traditional house and garden of Jiro's boss Kurokawa, the quasi-European mansion belonging to Jiro's fiancée and her father, and the sumptuously realized pastoral setting of Karuizawa, the famous mountain resort in the Japanese Alps, yet it must be acknowledged that the film suffuses even its darkest details with a literally golden nostalgic light, allowing the past to seem not simply a foreign country, but one that possesses a sensuous, deep, nostalgic appeal. While Miyazaki scrupulously recreates the authentic details of a moment in history, the settings are so exquisite, the lighting so rich, and the music so evocative that the pre-war period beckons invitingly. In a sense, Miyazaki has used history to create his ultimate fantasy country. So Napier's saying that this is kind of a fantasy setting for Miyazaki, is what he ends up doing with kind of 30s Japan, in his portrayal of that. And yeah, I don't know how different some of these places, some of these settings that we see in Japan are from some of his fantasy worlds. I think they are similarly kind of beautiful and seemingly ethereal, I guess, in some ways.
Well, it's also because a lot of the times, especially with his like realistic movies, I know he didn't do Grave with the Fireflies, but at the beginning of that, you see like the main characters and their family have quote unquote privilege, like they have money. And then this movie, Jiro's parents, like, you know, they fund him to go to engineering school. The sister gets to go learn how to be a doctor, and you would just assume that it's because their family has money. And that is like, I guess you could see that as an element of like fantasy, especially in these times where a lot of people were poor and they were like kids starving on the street. But it just, that part makes me the most uncomfortable with these kind of like historical movies that he's done, is that all the people he focuses on have, if not an impact of their own, it's because of like the money they have.
Yeah, there's even like that one scene where Jiro buys like the sponge cake, and then he tries to give it to like the two kids who are like, or the three children who are waiting for their parents to get off work or whatever. And even Honjo's like says to him like, "Were you expecting them to like say thank you and that you were their savior?" And he like, I don't remember if he ever answered that. So
he was like, yeah, maybe I was.
Yeah.
Like, okay, at least you admit it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is interesting. I saw this as a separate topic, but Aly's tying it into kind of the depiction of the setting. Like maybe Miyazaki's allowed to, it's this kind of hostile period for most people in Japan is allowed to be viewed in kind of this magical way if you're coming from a position of privilege, which I think is a really interesting point. I would say this movie is definitely Miyazaki grappling with a lot of stuff about him. So that's what that kind of leads me to that topic.
Which I had no idea about until I read your notes. So thank you for that.
Including his privilege, his family's privilege. He went through bombings, like World War II bombings while he was a young child. But he ultimately was from a family of a decent amount of wealth, so he was relatively safe compared to everyone else. And I do think like there is some grappling of privilege going on here intentionally. I think he's pouring his kind of soul into this movie. I mean, two very personal parts of this, which should be noted, is we've mentioned this before. Miyazaki's mother was bedridden and like through most of his childhood and then early adult period from tuberculosis, which is what what the love interest in this movie, Naoko, is suffering from, similar to what is implied in Totoro as the mom there. And then the sanatorium elements of that. And then maybe I think that is more well known. Maybe the lesser well known is Miyazaki's dad, who he was not like close to and wasn't a huge part of his life, but his dad and his uncle, like his family, they owned a factory that made parts for the Zero airplane. So he's kind of personally, like it's a thing that ties into his personal history, and he's kind of grappling with, similarly to Jiro, probably his role in what the creation of this technology ends up having in the destruction of World War II.
Well, and I guess it's also like he's probably grappling with the fact that like him and his family benefited from like, you know, these like machines that are just like the cause of such great like despair and destruction at the same time.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think all that is not a criticism. It is a feature of this movie. This is a movie where one of the big appeals to this movie, this is Miyazaki pouring his soul, and you see it on the screen in these different elements he portrays. And I think that is like a very appealing element from this kind of like high critic kind of sense of viewing films. And a lot of people, even if you're not viewing it from that like high of a lens, like it's something that is emotionally kind of resonant, I think, for a lot of people. Here's another angle in which this is a personal film for Miyazaki. This is from Susan Napier. She says, as such, it is also clearly a paean to the work that went into the movie itself, and a summation of what the animation process has been to Miyazaki over 50 years in the field, with Jiro and his story acting as a stand-in. Jiro, the director suggests, was in some ways a tragic figure who gave his all, and his motivation to make something beautiful is a desire that accords with Miyazaki's own life work, while the director demurs when the critic Shibuya insists that Jiro is Miyazaki, saying, "I created the Jiro I wanted." It is evident that the effort depicted in the film is a proxy for Miyazaki's own lifelong turmoil. Thus, The Wind Rises becomes an expiation of Miyazaki's own superhuman commitment to work, and a kind of bittersweet apology, or perhaps explanation, to his family and colleagues for the sacrifices he has made along the way. At the film's premiere, Miyazaki cried publicly for the first time in his career. Yeah. That, I mean, I think, good. And I think this is clearly the most Miyazaki's most personal film in a lot of ways. I think.
Yeah.
To me, that's really unexpected. I knew nothing about that.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about that. It's kind of like taking me aback just a little bit, just because, like, especially I guess whenever it's spelled out for me that, like, oh, I can definitely see like the parallels between Miyazaki and the Jiro he wanted or he created at the same time. So, and I guess it also makes sense for him to, you know, be so emotional about it, because I have no doubt that his family was there whenever it premiered, and that, you know, for them to see that and maybe even catch a glimpse as to like what he has also been going through and how he, you know, feels towards them would be a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about on this podcast the history of Miyazaki's relationship with his son Goro and the emotional turmoil behind that. And, you know, you could see this as him grappling with his lack of fatherhood for most of his children's life. As you know, putting his soul into his work, trying to create something beautiful, you know, maybe even an element of him not being sure if the beauty that he's trying to create is doing good. There's a part of Napier's chapter where she describes like this element of Miyazaki still kind of like ultimately being like, I don't know if these movies are good. Children should be outside playing, not inside watching movies. So I think like this uncertainty of like the reception and the moral effect of what he's even been toiling away at, probably similar to Jiro. And in addition to this kind of personal struggle representing his life work, the similarities to his own life that kind of go into the characters in the movie, there's also him grappling with his perspective in the world, which I think ties into all the war stuff, which I guess we should get into.
Definitely does. Can I jump off that, because it definitely does, and I want to mention not really a conversation, a paragraph that our patron, wow, I did it, Czar said about like this kind of like giving his all motivation of like the time that I didn't really think about, because they said that like, well, I knew about this. Like at the time, Japan's like lack of development was like competing with the West, and like at the time, the country was like pursuing a nationalistic sort of like goal for the sake of the country, their people, to like be on the map that like non-Western countries had to at the time and still have to fight for now. And Jiro's rather workaholic ethic proved that push, but it also like took a toll on his life with or without Naoko, whatever. Like it was like individuals suffering for the greater good. I don't agree with that lifestyle, but I think Miyazaki can definitely relate, since he's also a like workaholic, like animation workaholic, makes movie about engineer workaholic. It's very, you could tie it into everything.
Yeah, I think this one of this movie's more interesting points is it's not like a super major part of the movie's perspective, but it's kind of inherent in everything that's happening, is how Japan's kind of being pushed and influenced by Western powers in what's going on. I think it's a great point. And this is what's explored when they're visiting Germany, and it's what they talk about when they get back. We have to live up to this. How can we ever surpass it? And kind of one of the triumphs of the movie is Jiro eventually making something that does, for a brief time, surpass the West technology. And I think that should be noted. It should be noted when we're talking about all the kind of atrocities Japan commits in this World War II time period, and obviously has committed upon them, that Japan was, in the start of its history, forced into the Western culture and the openness of the world by Western powers who take advantage of Japan, who just wants to be closed off and serve their own people. And, this path that Japan, we see culminate in a really terrible way around World War II that Japan goes on, is set upon by imperialist nations, of course. So I think that's like context you have to keep in mind for what's going on with Japan here. At the same time, all this, still some terrible things that are happening for sure. It's all kind of true at once, and it's difficult to grapple with. But I do think the movie does a good job of portraying that context. I think it's to me one of its more intellectually interesting aspects of the film.
Yeah, that's what makes it, like, it succeeds in like making you going back to making you uncomfortable, but like keeping you grounded. Like you have to remember the context.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The context.
Well, and I think a lot of that discomfort comes from like probably the fact that we're Americans, and we are like we were the opposing figure at the time.
And they're also like in the background they mention like, oh well, we're trying to like beat America. That's never gonna happen. Like it's just very pessimistic in general.
Yeah, there are mentions of America, and should be noted we are coming at this movie from an American perspective. I'm about to quote Susan Napier, who has an American perspective, although I think it's best to quote her because she is incorporating many Japanese perspectives into her writing. So that's like in the most digestible form we can get. So we're going to try to portray other perspectives. It's not just us that find the portrayal of war in this movie off-putting. It's kind of especially a lot of people in Japan. So we'll note this. But yeah, let's talk into this as a war, the context of Wind Rises as a war movie or a lack of war movie. Should be noted, we talked a lot on the Howl's Moving Castle podcast about how that is Miyazaki intending to make his anti-war movie. And that's his big anti-war message, anti-Iraq war message. And now we have him getting kind of back to the subject matter in a much more complex way. And probably a movie that is much more centered just inherently because it's about a real past war and contributions to the war than this kind of vague war that's in the background of Howl's. Maybe the similarity between both of them is that war is pretty sanitized in both of those movies. Like we never see.
I was gonna just say like it's interesting that like he like doesn't like there's no like real depictions of war. I like your way of saying that it's sanitized. Like that's definitely sanitized.
Yeah, in Howl's, the war is mostly off screen. We see one scene of Howl fighting vaguely shadowy figures. And in this movie, the war is basically completely off screen. Should be mentioned before Ali was bringing up Grave of the Fireflies, which features which is Takahata's view on the war, and he I think led a less privileged life during World War II. Went through some terrible experiences, so we have seen a variety of experiences to a certain extent in the Ghibli canon. But here we see another perspective on Miyazaki's work. So here's like an introductory quote on this subject from Napier. I want to point out, I have some long quotes to read from Napier here. I'm pulling stuff I'm trying to make it the clearest and the most easy to read on a podcast, but I am lacking some of the nuance she portrays in her chapter. So if you're interested in the fuller picture, I'd recommend reading her chapter on this movie in Miyazakiworld, because I am lacking some nuance here. But I think she has some very good points, and she is very critical of Miyazaki in some ways, which I never seen her be critical before of Miyazaki in this subject matter. But there's some nuance in what she's trying to say. But okay, so in general, like Miyazaki making a war movie here, she says, in the eyes of some viewers, both at home and abroad, however, The Wind Rises is, with its celebration of the Zero, a politically ugly film. To them, the movie brings up painful controversies involving evasion and obfuscation concerning the Zero's role and Japan's war responsibility. Most harshly, some critics suggest that the movie and its director are an outright denial of one of the darkest periods of Japan's 20th century history, the long build-up to a war that would end not only in the destruction of Japan, but also in the devastation of the lands subject to Japanese militarism, Korea, China, and Southeast Asia. In their eyes, The Wind Rises is guilty of whitewashing in the war and responsibility, choosing to ignore Japan's imperialist aggression and the hundreds of thousands of deaths it caused, and instead highlighting Zero's technological superiority. Indeed, the only actual death in the movie is a romantic one, when Jiro's beautiful young wife succumbs to off-screen to tuberculosis. Miyazaki acknowledged that his own staff and family had doubts about whether he should do the film, and perhaps he did as well. In the interview with Shibuya, he mentions how he would put in and then take out a particular cut because of cowardice. But Miyazaki is not a coward. He clearly wants the film to be provocative, to stir up discussions of difficult matters his countrymen for decades wanted to sweep under the rug. As he said to Shibuya in a diatribe against the stupidity of his countrymen, the Japanese always sit back and thereby end up choosing war, and we're doing the exact same thing again, presumably a reference to the Japanese government's attempts to change the constitution to allow for aggressive warfare. I think that last part is the context, maybe why Miyazaki ends up making this movie as the hot button issue at the time. I'm unsure to what extent it still remains a big topic in Japan, but like the America forces a constitution onto Japan in which they cannot have an aggressive military. And there's been kind of recent pushes by conservative governments in Japan to eliminate that and to allow them to have more of a military, which Miyazaki has been on the record of being strongly against changing that. So I think that's on his mind during all this. This part of like, there's doubts while making the movie whether this was a good idea, which is chronicled. I want to say the production of Wind Rises is very well documented. There's 2 documentaries I'd recommend on this if you're interested. The big one is The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, which I think probably the best Miyazaki documentary out there, chronicles the production of this movie. And then I've referenced 10 Years with Hayao Miyazaki, which is available for free on the NHK website. Episode 4, No Cheap Excuses, also deals with the same production, and includes some similar scenes, which I'll talk about. But you see during those 2 documentaries, it's like, hey, should we be making this? There's doubts among the staff. So it's like it's realized this is controversial while it's being made. And the main lens, I think, when you see those documentaries is like, are we sure this movie is anti-war enough? Because everyone at Ghibli is very known for being politically anti-war, especially led by Miyazaki. And so people are kind of questioning, like, to what extent is this an anti-war movie?
I mean, it's hard to say, like, to what extent. I do think that it's interesting that in Napier's quote that, you know, they talk about like the director is in an outright denial. And I wouldn't say that he's necessarily in denial. I would say it's more so like, because, you know, we already discussed that he grew up, you know, more wealthy, and while he was still alive during, you know, all of these tragic events that took place, he was also, you know, more privileged at the time. So maybe this is all he really like he knows of the time, you know what I mean, of like actual war. But
yeah, it's a good point. He's speaking to his experiences. I mean, he was a kid during it, so he's never fighting in wars, and so he's kind of focusing on experiences similar to his own.
So I think I definitely think that's a harsh criticism for sure, just because like he was a kid at the time, like he wasn't actually fighting, and so this is, you know, his most direct like contact with like war during war times. So, and I do think that this has enough, you know, anti-war anti-war like messages, especially, you know, considering like the overall theme is, you know, creating something beautiful that's going to like cause so much destruction. Like it's sad to think or to even know that something that you're creating is going to cause devastation, not for yourself but for other people, like, and to hold that sort of responsibility is not fun for anyone.
Yeah, I think that on a basic level, the movie does try to make clear it's not, it doesn't like the use of the zero for war purposes. It's kind of its big anti-war theme. There's a part where Jiro's like, oh, we can make it so good. Oh, but, you know, we have to add in the guns. So that's not going to work.
Well, what is it? Like, every time Jiro, like, dreams and he meets the Italian engineer, like, the Italian engineer is always, like, talking about, like, his newest design that, you know, is meant for more of, like more leisurely like flight versus like, you know, and he even says like this isn't meant for war or just, you know, or it's not meant to hold guns, it's meant to like carry people in this design. And so I think that there's enough of that message like sprinkled throughout.
Yeah, and even when they're in Germany and they're looking at the design, they're like, it would be a waste to put a bomb here. Like, the people can sit in the wing.
Yeah, definitely. There's a ton of that stuff in the movie. I think it's clear at a high level what he is going for. I have a controversial hashtag spicy take on like this. Well, first of all, I think that like if your staff and, you know, if you're having doubts about whether or not you should do something that's controversial, if you like have ties to it personally, whether you're like a person of color writing about like what people of color have experienced or what have you, I think that's a good sign that like you are considering it enough that you are like being careful and you don't want to do the wrong thing. And also the fact that they like stated that he's in denial of the darkest period in Japan's history, whatever, like I feel like they're not taking into account that people at the time, most people in the country, and some people do still exist who do think that way, like that they, you know, like we're going to be militaristic and everything's going to be better and we're going to like have the more rights for our country or whatever. Like people did think that back then, and that like it's brought up in the movie a bunch of times. Like even if you don't see the main characters that way, they will touch on the fact that like that's what our country is thinking, and you know, what can you do except survive with it? I don't like personally agree with that take, but you know, people are like that. We're like that back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I mentioned again, I think that ties into how the hot button political issue Miyazaki has in his mind making this is the conservative attempt to bring back the military in Japan. So there's, of course, the conservative side of Japan, which does still think that way. It's a great point. All this criticism is coming from a liberal perspective. This is all like, this is all like, it's not like, hey, why do you, because, you know, the conservative criticism would be, why aren't you portraying war in a positive way, I guess. But like Miyazaki's known for being kind of a beacon of liberal principles in Japan. He's this pretty celebrity in a lot of ways, and he is outspoken in favor of a lot of liberal causes throughout these decades that he's been making movies. And these criticisms come from a place of people feeling let down after they had heard him espousing these progressive ideals, and then maybe make something that's not the most nuanced in a progressive way. So yeah, it's a good point. Should be noted, these are all kind of within progressive circle criticisms.
I'm just, the fact that they like said that that some harsh critics thought that he is choosing to ignore Japan's imperialist aggression. People do that all the time in Japan.
Yeah.
Like it's very,
you know, people are holding Miyazaki to a high standard here. I think that's for sure.
A little too high.
Let's get into that claim some more. Let's get into that claim with the next quote here. So this is about how the movie does not necessarily confront war, which isn't inherent in the criticism, but I think we've talked about how it sanitizes war already. So I think we probably agree with this to a certain extent. But Susan Napier says, in the movie, far more than the manga, however, the plane also becomes implicitly a thing of immense sadness, beauty distorted for evil and stupid purposes. At the end of the movie, Miyazaki incorporates a dream sequence in which Jiro tells his imaginary mentor, the pioneering Italian aircraft maker Caproni, not a single one came back. Incredible, Jiro is correct. The plane that had ruled the Pacific for a few brief years was ultimately eclipsed by more advanced aircraft that wrestled control of the skies and helped to turn the tide of war against Japan. The last part of the Zero's history was even more tragic. It became the vehicle ridden by the kamikaze fighters in the last months of the war, young men selected for suicide bombing missions against the American Navy. The movie makes no mention of the kamikaze, nor, besides the occasional visions of destruction granted to Jiro and the occasional intonation of the word Hametsu, destruction, does it ever come to grips with the terrible defeat that the Zero, by its early successes, ironically helped create. By giving Japanese an overinflated sense of confidence in the war effort, the Zeros helped to expand and prolong the war. In movie after movie, Miyazakiworld has displayed the stupidity and horror of war, and Miyazaki has taken every opportunity to excoriate the military in interviews and speeches. So his final film's lack of confrontation with the war and its aftermath seems especially problematic. I think that last part is a good summary of some uncomfortability with how war is handled here. Miyazaki
That
known
I
for
can
being
actually get behind.
Yeah.
Miyazaki, in a general sense, Miyazaki is known for being very anti-war. We don't really approach the war at all here in a movie that is centered around it. We just kind of avoid it. We stop right before the fighting really starts is where the movie ends up, the last part of the movie. For me, the fact that if you're on, I thought this was probably true, and looking it up, the Zero is the main plane which kamikaze attacks were done in.
Yeah.
Pretty striking to learn that after you watch this movie.
And the fact that they don't bring it up once.
It's not brought up once, yeah. Now it's
I mean, I guess if you're a weeb, you would know this, so it's implied. But like, it would be nice to have like a narration to be like, I don't even know, just to bring it up.
Thematically, it is maybe brought up in the fact that we have the main, potentially main theme of this movie is beauty distorted for evil. And,
right.
The implied evil is what ends up happening with the airplane.
But it's also, well, no, you mentioned that not a single one came back, and it's also shown visually, like the planes fly away and they never come back. But
yeah, he does say at the end, not a single, that is the reference to it.
If you don't know what like kamikazes are, then you're not going to have that
You're
background.
not going to get that. I
that
think.
really, like, that's dark.
It's brutal
really
context for
dark
this movie. This is one of the main things that makes this movie really hard to watch. I think is the context of this is the kamikaze plane, and we're looking at it with such a positive
hardest.
Light. Yes. Well, and even like it changes like almost like the context of scenes where like whenever they're like asking like, oh well, how many knots can it get up to? And he's like, oh, like it's designed to do 270. And they're like, they only want 220. And he's like, yeah, well, in a week, 220 won't be like enough. And so I think like I'm like,
that's very brutal. I don't like that anymore.
And as the quote alludes to, like the technological prowess of the Zero is, greatly helps the Japanese for a time period, but ends up like ultimately killing more people. I feel like it is kind of ironic context, I guess, and it's to me the kamikaze thing is kind of this direct context you like get implied at the end of the movie and makes it really really tough. It's just the reverential light in which the building of this plane is kind of looked on. I think, which is leads to the uncomfortability.
Like, personally, I did not care how the airplanes were made because engineers, while they're incredible, make me just feel really stupid. But that just makes me feel upset, knowing that that's, like, they worked on it so hard.
Not only do I feel stupid, I'm also upset.
Did you like all the math problems that Jiro was doing?
I did not care. I wanted them to skip past it because it just makes me anxious.
I'm glad that we acknowledged math in some way, even if it was one shot.
I'm upset with you now. I didn't approve this.
I'm pro math, okay?
I didn't greenlight that discussion.
Personal opinion. Okay, but
was it even math? That was, it was, I don't know what kind of math, like calculus.
It's crazy. It's like aviation math,
crazy people math,
which is terrible.
I don't know to what extent it was accurate.
I never went past college algebra, so this was like, I don't know.
I was like, do you know what calculus is? It's worse than that. Like,
they didn't even have a calculator. And what is that ruler?
20s. Yeah, he has that ruler thing. Yeah.
No, that ruler is a real thing. I'm like, from what I know of, like the aviation like industry and like I've known like some avionics like engineers and stuff like that. I'm like, I don't know what your messed up ruler is, but
it's
We have computers now. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about how the criticism of the fact that we just kind of don't display the war and we stop right before the war now. And we mentioned how like the film is like lovingly looking at a plane that is ending up used for evil. So here's the Susan Napier's discussing of that and how it's handled in the movie. She says, on one hand, Miyazaki loathes war and fiercely protests against it. On the other hand, he creates manga and films that celebrate the glories of military technology. Rather than explain the apparent contradiction, it is perhaps better to embrace it, as Miyazaki's producer Toshio Suzuki suggests. By his own account, it is Suzuki who, after reading the manga, persuaded Miyazaki to create the film version of The Wind Rises. The reason, according to the producer, was that he wanted to see how a supposed pacifist who loves to draw military technology would pit these contradictory positions in a film. According to Suzuki, Miyazaki is not alone in his contradictions. The producer says many Japanese people after the war felt this way, and goes on to suggest that The Wind Rises might serve as a hint as how to live in the times to come. In fact, across history and geography, humans have celebrated technological progress linked to suffering and death. Miyazaki deals with this directly with this troubling aspect of human spirit when he has Caproni ask Jiro, which would you rather live in, a world with or without pyramids? Caproni's implication is that the technological and aesthetic achievement of the pyramids was achieved only through hideous human suffering and sacrifice. Overall, the film seems to be arguing for the pyramids, no matter what cost, a thorny message that may be hard for some audiences to accept. In The Wind Rises, Miyazaki is attempting to confront a question that has engaged him in previous films, but to do so in a new and more challenging way. This is the question of whether technology can or should serve as an end in itself. In films such as Nausicaa, Laputa, and Princess Mononoke, science fiction and fantasy kept the issue at a safe remove. In this film, Miyazaki creates a new kind of fantasy, a history that stops just before the darker side of technological development appears. Yet this fantasy is historically grounded and as such no longer quite so arm's length. That the Zeros were magnificent technological achievements that brought death to tens of thousands is more than an inconvenient truth. To me, this is like the crux of the moral conundrum of this film. This is about Miyazaki's love of planes, which are used for war largely in recent human history. I mean, obviously, there's also a lot of planes used for commercial purposes and stuff, but he is specifically drawing planes that are kind of like fighter planes and stuff, and that's what he's depicting in this movie. And it's like, I think it's really interesting, and it is documented in these two documentaries. I mentioned how it's, Suzuki, who is, as I mentioned, the co-founder of Ghibli, the third most important person you need to know about Studio Ghibli. He's encouraging Miyazaki to make this movie. This isn't something that's natural to Miyazaki, is to make this, the film version of this. I think both because it's so morally complex and because it's an adult film too, which is certainly outside of his normal realm of films. But I find this movie ultimately morally questionable, but I guess agree with Suzuki because I do think it's fascinating to see it made. Ultimately, I am appreciative of it existing, and I think it is a really interesting, even if it kind of challenges your view of Miyazaki, challenges your view of of Studio Ghibli, of people like this. It's a very challenging movie. It is really interesting to have it exist and to analyze it like this.
It itself is a pyramid.
Yeah, wow, Illuminati. I want to come in with another spicy take because they see the quote where they say, "Oh, it seems to be like the film is arguing for the pyramids no matter what the cost." I don't agree with that. It's arguing that maybe your country argues for the pyramids and you have to go along with it because you have to survive. You just have to go with whatever the status quo is, which I hate, and I hate that we live in a society. But they even said across history humans celebrate technological process linked to suffering, and I agree with that take. But I don't think it's that I don't know, it's complicated.
I don't think it's that direct.
Yeah,
because okay, if you think about the history of aviation and the airplane, the first airplane wasn't invented or created or engineered for war. It was just because, two brothers were like, hey, let's see if we can fly. You know what I mean? So it's interesting that, especially in this quote, that they're technology is only created and celebrated after it's been used for like warlike purposes, but I don't think that's necessarily true. And I mean, yeah, the history of the pyramids is terrible, and the history of this, the Zero aircraft is also, complicated and not, beautiful. But I mean, I don't know. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's not. They're treating it like it's black and white, and I don't think it's.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so in the movie, Caproni does posit that we are better off in a world,
right?
With,
yeah.
But it is reasonable to suggest that is not what Miyazaki is saying. It's just
just because a character says that doesn't mean that's what the movie is saying.
I do think
exactly.
Caproni, if anyone in this movie is a stand-in for the movie's viewpoint, there's sometimes that narrator type character. It would be the kind of dream guy, the Caproni guy.
Yeah.
I think he's the closest, but it's still reasonable to not interpret it like that. At the very least, this movie is ambiguous with its position on, I think, on this. And here's the reason. It's not just about this pyramids thing, which, for me, no, I don't agree. It's worth to have the pyramids if it caused a lot of people to die. So I'm very uncomfortable with this notion. And to be fair, we are hammered. I think it's hammered into our heads growing up, that pyramids, like this kind of notion of beauty with sacrifice. I do think like society tries to get you to believe that it's worth it. Like we see the pyramids as this incredible thing. I mean, maybe it's just an American education
slaves
thing.
are involved. Like,
I mean, look at America in terms of history of kind of sanitizing things that are built with slave labor. It's constant. And our view of the pyramids is in accord with that. The big thing you have to keep in mind here is that it's not just a question of what's posited with the pyramids. This is what the movie is about, because Jiro spends his whole life making the Zero airplane, and it ends up being used for evil. And he is aware that this is happening. Like Jiro is complicit, in my opinion, in the destruction that is a result of the Zero airplane. Now, is it his fault? Is it is he a terrible person? Like, those are more complicated questions, but he is complicit, and this movie does not hold him accountable whatsoever, in my opinion. I don't think that this could be a potentially more intellectually interesting, or at least different movie. I think it's intellectually interesting on its own, but if this movie attempted to portray Jiro's complicitness, then we could get into a lot more moral complexity here. Miyazaki isn't interested in that, and potentially by not portraying that complicit nature, he is inherently endorsing this view that the pyramids are worth it. He is inherently celebrating the Zero airplane in all its beauty. That's all the movie is about, and he literally stops before it's ever used for any harm. I think it's completely reasonable to interpret, I think, and if not the intent, then the ultimate result of this movie on its audiences as an endorsement of this notion that the pyramids are worth it.
That's the thing. It's definitely impact over intent. But with this, like the way they phrased it, it sounded like they were like, the intent of it was this. And I'm like, I don't think so. But it was definitely the impact. Yeah,
I was like, I think that's definitely like the bigger debate, though, is the impact over the intent. Because, Jiro always wanted to like create planes.
Right.
Like it was never his intent
because
to create
planes are beautiful.
Yeah, it was never his intent to create a plane that, caused devastation and, brought about the deaths of tens of thousands of people. But also, like, I do agree that there's a bit of complacentness on his part, because, like, is your dreams like worth those lives? And there's definitely like no accountability whenever it comes to that, for sure.
Like, I really thought. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I think like it would be I think it's interesting that they're using pyramids as like the beautiful thing that they're sort of like, I guess, like visually using. Well, like, why wouldn't you say something along the lines of like, oh, like, would you rather a world with or without the Mona Lisa? Like, what? Like, it changes.
Pyramids, like, in my mind, are exclusively bad. But
yeah, like, I mean, I guess they're. I don't even.
Pyramids are considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. I think it's the perfect analogy, because we know it's built by slave labor, and we also know it's considered one of the greatest achievements in human history. It's like
America.
Yeah.
So yeah. So
it's just like it's I don't know, like it's so hard to like you want to hold Jiro responsible, but at the same time, like you can't. But I don't know, like
yeah. So to explain it a little further, this movie is clear that Jiro is not interested in contributing to war, in his planes being used for war. My personal viewpoint, and the viewpoint of I think potentially the critics here that are being cited, is that that is not enough to just say, "Hey, I wish this wouldn't be used for war, but I'm going to go about making it anyway, knowing that it's used for war."
Yes.
He's contributing to it, with the knowledge that it will be used for war, and does not
even like
stop and think about it.
He like says it outright. He's like, this country could feed like the whole country if it was paying as much as it is to Germany or whatever. But if they want airplanes, I'll make them. And like what makes me annoyed with part of this movie, like I love the sister, partly because she's voiced by Mae Whitman in The Dove. But anyway, she's great. She's smart. She points out like into with Jiro in reference to his relationship with Naoko that like he's being selfish. He should like focus on what's best for her first. And like I really expected her to be like, you're being an enabler, like making these planes for the country that's only going to result in devastation. Like be a doctor with me and do an actual good thing. Like I'm annoyed that they didn't use her for that, kind of, because she's the only one with the brain cell in this whole movie.
The one brain cell. Yeah, there's
especially whenever like they were like people are constantly remarking and stating that Jiro's like a genius, like he's like this like up and coming
That's the thing. This movie portrays Jiro as the only one that could have made the Zero, so he is kind of directly responsible with the fact that he does in that regard. Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
Well, it's interesting that also like that Jiro, because again, Jiro's only ever wanted to make beautiful planes. Like that's been his goal and his dream. But like if you're so like up and coming and such a genius at what you do, why is it that you have to go like why do you have to achieve it via a military route or does that make sense?
And I think the tragicness of his situation is that is the only path available to him. Like we see
he wanted to be a pilot, and then he was not colorblind. He just couldn't see.
We see he wants to be a pilot. He can't do that. We see that many people don't have jobs throughout the war. There's a specific scene. It's like no one has jobs here, so he gets a job. It's just at a military contractor making tools of destruction. That is presumably his only path available to make planes in this time period. And we don't. If this movie wanted to have Jiro stop and ruminate about the consequences of his decisions, I think it could have done that a lot more. I think it's clearly not as interested in that. And relating it back to Miyazaki, again, loves war technology. It's not that he likes planes in general. He specifically is drawing military planes. So this notion of he is celebrating the beauty of something that is used for evil purposes, we can bring that back to what I view to kind of be the main theme of the movie, the corruption of beauty. That he is clearly not deterred too much by in his own personal musings in terms of drawing because he drew this as a manga before, and the manga is like less story based, more just like here's pretty warplanes, and he's done that kind of throughout his movies. He's not really interested in the fact that these are tools. He's interested in celebrating the beauty of something that ends up being used for destruction. I think that's like a intellectually interesting theme on its own. I think it's a very common theme in a lot of things. His drawing of manga of warplanes is not really morally consequential compared to what Jiro is doing. So I will say that, like, it's not that if he has a hobby, he just wants to draw warplanes, sure. Now he is like the most influential animation artist of all time, and so him putting a lot of military technology in his movies. But he also clearly has anti-war themes throughout, so I don't think people would argue he ends up having a moral negative consequence because of putting these types of planes in. I think he clearly shows them used for destruction. It's only kind of in this film where he finally like fully celebrates the technology to the extent that he kind of is personally doing. And it's really off-putting for me, like, and I think for a lot of people, I think that's basically what it comes down to. Is like, it's like I accept that this is something Miyazaki likes on his own. I accept that it's how it's used in his previous movies. It's just here where he kind of like gets into pretty clearly questionable, if not negative territory with his revering of the beauty of something that has moral negative consequence.
Mm.
You know, despite all that, it's still really interesting what he does get into. It's not like I want him to get to. It's not like I want the version of the movie where Jiro constantly thinks about the consequences of his actions, because viewing this movie as a reflection of Miyazaki, I think is far more interesting. Like he's making the movie that's true to himself. To a certain extent, he's really like taking off the mask that is there to a certain extent when he's making these fantasy children-oriented films. This is the truest display of his tastes and his moral composition, at least in old age. It should be noted. You know, he is very old at this point. So, like what would 40-year-old Miyazaki have thought of this movie, have made this movie? I'm not sure. He's also gone through a lot of life experience. It's very complicated, but I think the appealing part of this movie is certainly this is like an honest reflection of a very complicated and influential and incredible man, and like the display of that on the story, the reflection of that on the story in which he's telling.
It's definitely. I was going to say it's definitely like quite, because this was supposedly his last movie, and so it's definitely like an interesting way for him to go out as well. Like, but it's not his last movie, so I guess it doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah, we'll see what ends up.
I still like the take that it hints that. It hints to its audience, like, how do you want to live? Like, do you want to live in a society like this or nah? Like, think for yourself, kind of. I kind of prefer like a more. I mean, it's hard to sit with, but I prefer that than having something like in your face, being like, this is how you should live. Like, don't do this, do this. Like, to me, that makes me more uncomfortable. Or
even it gets you to sort of like think about, okay, you want to, create something beautiful. How can you go about it in a way that's not like the pyramids or like the zero plane,
where you consider all of the consequences, probably.
Yeah, I think that's a nice, generous interpretation of this being kind of like intellectually open to interpretation. It's certainly not a moralistic movie that is throwing a theme at you. So yeah, I think you could totally. I see that.
I think it's both. Like it's throwing beams at you, but it's not telling you what.
The most throwing this movie does is like Jiro talking about how he doesn't want his planes used for war, and that's it's clearly. I feel like it's clearly in response to Miyazaki being afraid of this movie not being anti-war enough, so he kind of puts those those things.
But I'm also curious how the actual man like came to terms with that after everything happened, because did he live through World War II? I know nothing about.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And Miyazaki read Jiro's autobiography growing up, and so that's why he lived until 1982.
Oh wow!
So
I think
complicated figure, but
yeah. I mean, I'm sure he must have had regrets. He wasn't a terrible person for doing what he did, but he was an enabler, complicit, whatever.
Yeah,
and obviously, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, Jiro is not the person who is most at fault. It should be noted. It is, the people with the highest powers in charge of making these war decisions. And then it's Mitsubishi, the company, is more responsible than him. And then it's, it's not like we're talking levels of magnitude, but
it's still a pyramid, like April said before.
Yep.
Everything's a pyramid.
And of course, the surrounding context of how the Japan is dealt terrible hands by the rest of the world and imperialist nations. All of this is surrounding context. This movie, it is worth it to view it through the lens of personal moral responsibility, I believe, or at least that's what I think. I don't know if this movie is at least somewhat interested in that in terms of viewing Jiro's personal moral choices, but not clearly ultimately that interested in terms of this other lens of Jiro grappling with everything. Anyway, I think we said it, but yeah, I think that's like even though we spent a long time on that, that's kind of the short version of how complicated the subject is in this movie. And I don't know if we want to use this as transition. That's like half the movie. Here's the other half, which is
you can talk about like the thing that's focused on more, if well, maybe it's not focused on more. I don't know. It's complicated with this whole romance thing because it feels like it's put above the war in the sense that like the war isn't depicted like we'd normally expect from an anti-war person.
Yeah, you get his personal romantic life instead of these shots of the war instead of front life. So I was struck by how dominant the romance is in the second half of the movie. Watching it again, I think the first half is mainly focused on Jiro's rising career, and then the second half is like 70-30 romance. Like,
well, maybe it's because she's dying. I guess that's why they had to like
kind of got to
bring it
on that
100 because that's also how the character felt.
At a high level, let's note that Miyazaki is not one known for romance, and he up until Howl's Moving Castle, he basically has very minimal displays of romance. I mean, in his movies he directs, he does have some more in the ones he writes. I think there's some more romance stories, but he's really, no characters ever kiss until Howl's, right? That's something like that's kind of memed about with Miyazaki. And then there's kind of this like very vague kind of kiss at the end of Howl's. Then in Ponyo, which you could view that movie as very romance centric as well, although it's like a very child romance and it's not. I view it less as a romance,
childlike adoration versus.
Yeah, I view it more as like a friendship, but
they're best friends. They seem to be
it's in
good
a lot
friends.
of ways Miyazaki is portrayed. They seem to be good friends. There's a lot of ways Miyazaki is portraying it in terms of romance, and it ends, with a kiss as well. And so all of his last three movies here. We talked about late stage Miyazaki, and I would view these three. Napier views these three as kind of a group of his films. Personally, I think I echo Napier's sentiments when I say each of these three is a step down probably from his earlier films in each of their own ways. They each have kind of these flaws to them. Howl's, Ponyo, and then Wind Rises. But also each of them are romantic centric. I don't see those two tied together or anything. I just think it's also an interesting direction he ends up going. And here in this movie, this is a full on adult romance that is portrayed like extensively, epically, dramatically. I'm a
big fan, even though it's controversial. Just in the background of everything, it's uncomfortable, but for me, I think it's the best he's done romance. But I also just love the drama. I live for it.
I think this is by far his best romance for sure.
Yeah,
in terms
I
of
will
his
also say,
directed movies.
Apart from this one, and I believe Poppy Hill and Whisper of the Heart, nobody says "I love you" except in these movies, and that's not like a common thing in Japan because repressed feelings.
Yeah, I think you could view his earlier romances as not overt displays of feelings in accordance with the culture. But yeah, no, in this movie we get I love yous, we get a marriage, we get many kisses. Perhaps the most striking thing in the history of Miyazaki films is we get an implication of sex in this movie.
Yes.
And we get with consent.
Yes.
Well, sure. But
yes.
Of course for Miyazaki. But,
and also, not implied, initiated by the wife. Because, yeah, girl, get it.
But
I'm dying, but you still gotta get it. Like
before I die, please.
He's like, you sure? And but it's I mean, before Wind Rises come out, you would never ever expect him to ever make a movie which had any scenes that imply having sex in it. And
that was like the most wild part of the movie for me. I'm not gonna lie.
If you're looking at this from a Miyazaki scholar perspective, like all of the stuff is like kind of in accordance. It's a more extreme version, all these themes and stuff, but it's in accordance with the views he has. But then you get to like the way the romance is handled, and especially it's shocking. Like,
it is. But it's very well done, and it's unexpectedly so because you don't see it ever.
Yeah, I think if you view it as like he's written and contributed to some incredible romance films in the Ghibli canon, I think you could view this in accordance with that. But you wouldn't expect him to direct his own, like the multiple kissing scenes, and just a story which is prevailing, I think, throughout the movie.
Was there no like co-director or anything for this?
I mean, no.
Wow.
Written and directed by me. I mean, obviously, there's a ton of people in Ghibli who are animation-wise influential to all those movies. But no, it's so this. No co-writer or anything would be.
That's what I meant.
No, I mean, this is very Miyazaki. It's based on his own manga. He's adapting his own manga based on his favorite book growing up. Like,
Is there a sex scene in the manga?
like I said, I think the manga is, I haven't read it, but I've read it's much more focused on the planes, less on the romance. So I think it's probably there, but more of a background detail. But yeah, he takes it from this How Do You Live, or no, that's the next movie. He takes it from The Wind Has Risen book. I think it's probably appealing to Miyazaki and the way it relates to what he went through with losing someone with his mother. I think that's a big aspect of this. And I do think he's latched on more to personal intimacy, though, later in his life, at least in the displays of his films. And that's really interesting. That he's more interested in those displays.
I was going to say, I found the small displays of affection were like I really enjoyed them. Like whenever Jiro's working and she's like, just hold my hand. Like,
Listen, I'm a fan of small gestures over grand gestures, period. So that just makes me cry.
Yeah. Especially because, she doesn't feel well and everything like that. And then,
yeah. I didn't like that he smoked in front of her, though. I
hated that. She's got tuberculosis.
You had to smoke a cigarette, really? She's dying right next to you, and you're going to contribute to that.
We've never really talked about Miyazaki's relationship with tobacco and smoking, but it is very prevalent throughout all his
But
films,
it's also a huge thing in Japan.
Yeah, cultural difference and all. Yeah, I did read this movie was criticized by tobacco foundations though, or anti-tobacco foundations. Yeah.
How are you going into a 19-something movie expecting there to be no tobacco?
Probably smoking in front of a sick person, probably not the best.
That's the worst part.
But, I mean, okay, I understand because I did have a moment where I was like, man, these people are smoking a lot of cigarettes, and then I was like, yeah, but it's the early 1900s, so everybody was smoking all the time.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at this from a tobacco prevention perspective, it's also a character heroic like Jiro smoking, I think is different from maybe Yubaba smoking in Spirited Away. He's a villain, so I think this is a little bit of a different story, but he is pretty constantly presented, and Miyazaki smokes himself, not super regularly, I think, but he does in documentaries I've seen. The romance. One thing about the romance, I think it's beautifully presented. A little sketch on when they meet, when she is 13, I think, or something pretty young. I think that's a sketch introduction for the romance. Of course, nothing happens, and it's more just but they're clearly he's enamored with each other right away, and it's okay, but probably realistic to the time period.
I was gonna say, I think it's realistic, but I do like that. I guess the majority of the romance takes place after she's grown up.
We skip a long time until they're clearly adults. Yeah. So that's good. The relationship of her being sick, and then there's the parts about their decision, which I was surprised how much it's portrayed negatively by the people around them. Which it's they're focusing on living Naoko's last years or months or however long to the extent that they want to, versus trying to have her receive treatment.
I think that's I don't like that. I guess every other character was just she needs to be getting treatment, and I'm if she already knows she's dying, let her
do
live
what
out.
She wants.
Yeah, and
I don't like that. I mean, I like that the sister pointed out that he's being selfish about it, but it was also her decision. It wasn't just monopolized by him.
Exactly.
She came to see him, right? He didn't tell her to come over.
Yes. She clearly wants to be with him, and then leaves before he gets to really see, and is presenting herself as healthier than she is, and then leaves before he gets to see her at her worst before she dies. It clearly does seem to be Naoko's decision, but Jiro is on board, and I think it's good that the movie questions that decision with the other characters.
I also take it back. The boss's wife has the other brain cell, so the sister and the wife have the two brain cells in the movie, because she's the one who's no, let her go, let her do what she wants.
Yeah, wait until she gets on the train,
yeah. She is cool.
I think if the movie made clear that she is definitely dying and there's definitely no cure, then I would be more on board watching with their decisions.
Yeah.
They're not really clear with that.
Well, I was going to say, I think maybe it just comes from, maybe my acceptance of it comes from the sense that I know, I know what tuberculosis is. I know what it does to people. Like, so I'm like, okay, I get it. Like, she
Right. I
wants
think
to.
we know that. I'm like, do they know that? Like, do the character, like, I think it's implied the sister who's studying medicine would know that she's definitely dying.
Yeah, but she's the only one.
She's
like,
the only
do
one.
the rest of them, like, did she learn this in the sanatorium? Like, I don't know. So,
I'm sure.
but
I feel like she did, but
I think that's probably what's behind her decision to go be with the person who she wants to be with at the end of her life. Yeah, I think that's she sees the suffering around her, and she's like, I might as well.
But like, then it's also implied that even Jiro knows, because he says like every day is precious because we don't have a lot of time.
Yes,
I think
which
so.
is why like they want to get married and like quickly.
What do you think? I think the wedding was pretty beautiful.
It was really nice.
I loved it.
I want to get married in a kimono, but also I really don't, because they're very uncomfortable. But they're very pretty.
Yeah, I'd have the weeb wedding. I think.
Yeah,
so.
I need. If I do get married, it's going to be very weeby. Naruto headbands.
Naruto themed wedding. I like it.
You do the Naruto run down the aisle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
No, the wedding was gorgeous. Susan Napier, I don't have a quote, but she largely describes it as like a very fairy tale romance. It's kind of
very sad.
I won't lie. Like, I kind of teared up a little bit whenever like she like. They first open the door and you see her there, and I'm like, she's so beautiful.
Yeah.
You're a lucky man.
Yeah, man. A wife.
I think it's gorgeous, it's tragic, it's very affecting, I think, and I know we spent a lot of time criticizing kind of this overall moral view of the movie, but this movie seems very laser focused on Jiro's life. And what he's specifically going through and we see that manifested with his personal life with Naoko, and then we see it manifested with his role in building planes and doing what he wants to do in terms of building something beautiful. It's very laser focused on Jiro's life and his experiences, and I think that is very successful. That's like the strength of the movie. Is like this is all we see the journey of this person, and the criticisms are like, but we don't see enough of the overall context. But I think the reason we don't is because Miyazaki is so laser focused on Jiro, for better or for worse. And I think it does make for compelling storytelling, especially with Naoko, I think, which is probably the most compelling parts of his personal journey.
Agreed.
Jiro, we can talk more about that when we talk about the characters, but yeah, Jiro is voiced by, in the Japanese version, Hideki Anno, which is Miyazaki's longtime friend and director of Neon Genesis Evangelion. My
God, are you serious?
You didn't know this? He's a famous anime director. That's why you got to watch the sub. I
knew I recognized that name. Oh my God.
Anno worked with Miyazaki on Nausicaa before making his own studio, and they've been longtime friends since. And the number one reason I would recommend watching one of these two documentaries I mentioned, 10 Years with Hayao Miyazaki or Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, is both feature the exact same scenes, but it's the most compelling documentary scenes of Miyazaki of Suzuki proposing to Miyazaki, like, hey, what if we got your friend Anno to voice Jiro? And Miyazaki just like is instantly giddy at the, like, he's like so happy at the, and this is the happiest I've ever seen Miyazaki.
Have I never seen this?
I would recommend seeing it. And he remains so giddy, and then like they start recording, and he's like, yeah, we're going with it. And then he starts recording lines, and Miyazaki's just trolling him the entire time as he's recording lines for the movie. It's really wonderful, but that's a very notable, I think, aspect of the most notable like voice casting choice in Ghibli films is you have another famous anime director voicing Jiro, and the logic in the documentary is like they're going for someone like pretty understated and normal, and like they weren't getting that out of the voice actors they brought in, so they're like, what if we go with a more normal person like your friend here? I think it's really successful with Jiro's voice.
He is not a normal person. I'm just saying. He did Evangelion. Or Evangelion, whatever.
Not an actor, Yeah. How does Joseph Gordon-Levitt do with her? Is he also pretty understated in his delivery?
I think he did it really well. Like, he got I mean, I don't want to say monotone because Jiro isn't like monotone, but he has like that calm demeanor.
Very
but also
calm,
when he's excited about the airplanes, I didn't expect Joseph to like, I know him on a first name basis now, to like do it so well, but I will say I didn't watch the whole thing dubbed, so April, tell me what you thought.
I think he did very well. I think something that I applaud voice actors is especially whenever like they're already sort of like a big time name and you don't like outright recognize their voice for a character. So I really enjoyed that I didn't like outright recognize that it was Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Same with like John Krasinski. Like there was like after I knew it was him and I could catch like moments of him, like of it being John versus like Hanjo. So I really enjoyed that. So I thought they both did very well. I think it's of note that the young Jiro is voiced by Zach Callison.
Yes.
So.
The baby.
Yes. Steven and Steven Universe.
Yes.
Yeah. We see him at the start of the movie, young Jiro.
I was just like, is that Steven?
Yeah, who else replayed that like 30 times in the dub?
Yeah.
The first 10 minutes.
Probably pretty different characters, Steven and Jiro.
Oh my god, yeah.
Absolutely.
But also, when you get to Mae Whitman, all you hear is Katara or Amity, so it's the same thing. Very different characters.
I didn't know Amity grew up to be a doctor. I guess Katara's she heals.
It works for Katara because she's a healer, but...
Yeah,
I also find it very interesting that Emily Blunt did the voice of Naoko.
Yeah.
Not John's wife.
Not John's wife.
It was so good. I also, her English accent, well, rather her American accent was very... shocking. I've never heard her speak in an American accent before.
She does a very like she hides her like actual accent very well. So again, it's always nice and like refreshing whenever like I hear a voice and I don't know. Yeah, I'm not like, is that Emily? I'm like, Emily.
That's a really good point. It's very cool when that happens.
Even also, like with like Stanley Tucci, like the whole cast. Yes. Like I was like,
we would be remiss if we didn't bring him up, even though it was ridiculous.
Gotta love
his Italian accent.
Okay, I want to hear it for that.
Yeah,
Martin Short as the boss. I think that's who I would probably imagine being that voice. So I think that's pretty.
You did a really good job too, but it was weird.
There's a lot of big names and minor characters too. In I'm looking at the dub, including Ronan Farrow. I think Ronan Farrow's in another Ghibli dub too.
Like Ghibli dubs, they get a lot of big names for minor roles, probably because they don't have to pay them that much.
Darren Criss, Elijah Wood, Mandy Patinkin in minor roles. Interesting. No, I think actors know Miyazaki is the best and want to be in his at this point and want to be in his dubs.
Oh, yeah.
And also they're like the highest profile dubs ever made. All the Disney dubs after Spirited Away and later are like the highest profile dubs.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, that's Jiro. And Naoko. I mean, I think we talked about her through her romance with Jiro, but also
it is a little creepy, at least at the beginning. What is their age difference? Because there is one. That's all I know.
I interpret her as like 13 or something, and him as a college student is what.
Yeah,
I was gonna say I took it as like she was like 13, maybe 14, and he was like 17, maybe 18. So
yeah, I think he was a high school student, but he was definitely in college.
Yeah, he was
early college student.
Yeah. So,
I think that's right. And he, not like anything romantic's going on, but he's like he's clearly enchanted with her quoting something that he likes. So
yeah.
They both speak French for some reason.
Well, then he's also, I guess,
that's
like
how you know they're smart.
Yeah.
You speak
he's
French.
He's also like respectful in a sense because he doesn't like immediately like pursue her. Like it's not.
In fact, and to his credit, I described it as a little creepy, but he specifically does not pursue. He does not leave his name with anyone. So it's like he clearly is not doing this for romantic purposes. I think it's clear he feels some way, but he is like specifically avoiding it because I guess it would be inappropriate or for whatever reason.
Yeah. And it's okay that she. I mean, I don't know. Is it okay that she feels more because she's younger and like more susceptible? That feels like it's part of a bad element, but
I think it would only be a part of a bad element if like throughout the year, like if he had immediately
that's true.
pursuing her, but the fact that it comes from just like within herself that's on her.
And like that one magical encounter, blah blah blah.
Yeah, and it was just a crush. He did seek out. He went to the house at some point to try to find her. So
that's true.
Yeah, but that can be interpreted as just to be like, "Are you okay? I'm glad you're like
right.
got through everything." But it also could be interpreted as creepy. So.
I was going to say I didn't interpret it as creepy. I just took it as him just being a nice guy and making sure they were okay.
I will say it feels right for the time period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I thought you meant him not being creepy.
No, the age gap and the starting of romance at a
But I
young
don't
age
know,
for
was that
women.
like wasn't really no one cared about that back then because it was like if you could find a guy who's rich, marry him.
Right. I think I mean I think it wouldn't have been frowned upon if the romance started when they first met.
Yeah.
Potentially,
I was afraid the dad was going to try and set them up after like they found out he was an engineer. If I'm being
Yeah,
completely
and then
honest.
the dad later mainly portrayed as being just worried because she's sick.
Oh yeah, no wait, I forgot that one European guy who was at the lodge. He's the best character.
Castorb, that's who I was talking about.
Oh, I didn't know he had a name.
Castorb, the weird guy. Yeah,
Castorb.
He's anti-Nazi, and so then the Japanese secret police starts going after him, and then they go after Jiro because he's associated with him. Yeah,
He was the best character. I like the way he ate his salad.
That was really strange how they focused on
he just has like a giant bowl of like weird like greens, and then he just like scoops it onto his
kale
plate.
salad. Like every time I watch a Ghibli movie, I get hungry, and they always make me want a food I would never consider eating.
You want just a salad that's only kale and nothing else?
In reality, I don't, but watching that scene, it makes me want to. Yeah.
Even that can be made appealing by
They could eat
Ghibli's
dirt,
animation,
and I would want to eat.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's Castorb. I think he's pretty funny. So he's weird and it's a nice. He's clearly quirky, and then it's nice. He's like quirky in an anti-Nazi way.
I didn't get to him in the dub, but I'd like to watch the dub to see how they do his or how they portray him.
Werner Herzog as him. That's one of the top ones. We have Honjo. We talked about as his friend. I really like Kurokawa, his boss.
Yeah.
I just love the intro scene of him just ordering him around, and he's like, hi, like over and over, like, yep, okay, sure. And then he's like, he ultimately does care about him and invites him into his home where he hides from.
And he cries at the wedding.
I know.
It's a nice direction to take that character. That character, I think, is usually more unsympathetic.
But then you also remember that he was the boss at Mitsubishi, so he's also complacent.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, he's the boss of the engineers, and then we see his boss is also a character. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all of them. But we have Kaio, his sister. I think is
best girl.
Good character.
Best girl.
She's a doctor. I love her.
I feel like she doesn't look very old when she's apparently a doctor at the end. But I guess she's like in training. You learn. She's
an intern or whatever.
Yeah.
How long was med school back then?
Probably years? Not as long. Yeah, she'd have to be 30 right now, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah.
She's probably like early 20s. Yeah. And then Caproni. Honestly, I think Caproni is one of the most significant characters. Is who he meets in the dream sequences.
Yeah.
I do think the dream sequence is really magical and gorgeous. My favorite part is when there's the giant paper airplane in the second dream sequence, which I made the screen cap for this. And then in real life, I think one of the most enchanting romance scenes is when he's trying to fly the paper airplane up to Napier.
Yes. Oh, that's a great scene. The music in that scene too is really good.
Mm-hmm.
It's like an obvious thing. It's like this movie's all about the creation of planes, a plane engineer, so he makes paper airplanes. But it's also like it works. Like
yeah.
It's like, sure, he's a paper airplanes. Okay, but it feels pretty resonant.
He just likes planes in any shape or form.
It's
paper, wood, metal.
Eventually metal, yeah. That's the progression we gotta go through, yeah.
I was ready for him to have like that's a ship in a bottle. I was gonna say an airplane in a bottle because I'm crazy. Are there people have airplane models, I guess.
We've had ship planes in Miyazaki lore, so it's in line with that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of that. Any other comments on the Jiro and Naoko romance or either of those characters?
No.
No. Okay.
I would say no, I don't know how to phrase this without sounding silly, but the way that the drama was done, it's made me, I think Michelle also said this in chat, it's like I've never cared about a hetero couple this hard in a while. Like it's been a while. And it makes it so sad. But also, I mean, it's complicated because you don't like any of the decisions they make.
You haven't cared that much since last movie, since Papio.
Well, I care about the kids more because they're babies.
It's easy, yeah, right? Like adult, yeah. I do think with all these other Ghibli romances, they're all like children. They're naturally sympathetic, and here you have adults. And
I'm glad you bring that up that it's an adult movie because I keep kind of forgetting about it. even though I don't really know why, because most of his movies are about like adolescence.
Yeah, I mean, the only film you can really compare this to in this regard would be Porco Rosso, which I do view as an adult movie, but I do think is more of like a fun movie that kids can enjoy.
I have to watch that movie.
And yeah, and I'm honestly, you could apply some of the things a lot of the things we're talking about in terms of the war criticisms to Porco Rosso, but like we just didn't talk about it, and it's not part of the discourse for that movie. And I think just because of the completely different tone, the more fantasy fun nature of the movie, I don't know, but it is interesting to think about that because you could view Porco in a similar way.
Yeah,
I think Porco's viewed more morally gray at least by him. He's more self-doubting, I guess, and he's viewed more complexly. Jiro's presented very heroically and very fairy tale like, I guess, in terms of his journey. They feel like different characters too. Personally, I think Porco comes across as a more complex, better character in the end, but Jiro certainly goes through a lot of experiences in this movie, and we sympathize and empathize a lot with him, I think, throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the two plane movies, of course. In terms of Jiro and Naoko, I think the major other thing to talk about is the ending of the movie.
Yeah.
Which we can briefly mention Joe Hisaishi's score for this movie, which I did not dive into as much as his other ones. However, the main thing I note is there's several tracks on the soundtrack labeled A Journey, and then parentheses something, which all involve kind of this. I don't know what's the theme for planes, curiosity, invention, but it's kind of I feel like the musical through line throughout the movie, and yeah, I guess goes in that direction. And
well, it kind of relates to the sky if you want to pull it all together.
Yeah.
The theme of the sky, you could say that, yeah. But I definitely when I think of this movie's sound, I think of this one theme that prevails throughout, which is prominent on the soundtrack. I love the end credits song, which is Hikoki Gumo by Yumi Matsutoya. It's from 1973, actually, and they finally use it in this movie. I don't know if it's not like, I think she's done tracks on a previous Ghibli film or two. I don't remember, but I think it's a really great one to close out the film. And at the end, let me read this last quote from Susan Napier on kind of the ending and how it changed and the themes of the ending of the movie. She says, "Yet the movie does not end in tragedy, at least for its protagonist. In a coda set in the future after the war, Jiro sees Naoko appear before him, still young and beautiful, her white parasol whipping gaily in the wind. In the movie's original ending, the movie's original ending had Naoko saying, 'Kite, come,' but this was changed by Suzuki, who apparently because 'come' suggested Naoko is inviting Jiro to join her in the world of death. In the completed film audiences, she tells her husband, 'Ikite,' live, echoing Ashitaka's 'Ikiro' in Princess Mononoke. But in my view, the world Naoko had asked Jiro to come to is not necessarily the world of the death, but the world of dreams, imagination, beauty, and hope. In other words, it is the animated universe that Miyazaki has conjured up over the past 40 years, and one that his films will continue to invite us to for years to come." This kind of conclusion to the discussion, which I thought was pretty. But yeah, it's interesting how originally she's saying come, and she ends up saying live.
Yeah, I'm glad they replaced that, because I would have interpreted it as like coming to die also.
Yeah, I feel
Are
like
you ready to die with me?
It's the prevailing interpretation. But I like Napier's interpretation. That's not like probably what Miyazaki meant.
Oh yeah, totally.
So, but we end up with a similar message to Princess Mononoke. We discussed that a lot on that podcast about this Ikiro theme, which is live even in the worst and hardest of times. You have to strive to live, and we end this movie in one of the worst times in human history, right before that, but then that epilogue takes place right in the crux or right after the war. And, Jiro is urged to live similarly to Ashitaka in that movie. I do like how this epilogue ending kind of does acknowledge the darkness of the period. We've talked a lot about how the movie sanitizes the war, sanitizes all these challenging aspects. I think it is very good that the ending of the movie does at least touch on them. Yeah, and so she passes away. Naoko in the background, he like feels a wind when like in his moment, it's very tragic in his moment of greatest triumph when the Zero has a successful test run. He's not celebrating because he senses that she's died, and then we see her at the end in this kind of dream sequence, which I think is also a nice way to tie in the dream sequences he's been having with Caproni, which relate to his plane invention side of things, to his romance with Naoko and how that ends.
It all comes together.
Yeah, I think it does feel complete and good at the end of the movie. Like, I do think it's a very well made movie, a very very narratively strong film, especially compared to his previous two movies, which Miyazaki's previous two movies, which we wouldn't describe as narratively strong, at least as their strongest elements of Howl's and Ponyo. I think this certainly has a strong story at its core, driving the film.
Yeah.
Any comments on the ending, or any scenes we haven't talked about? Oh, how about the mackerel bones is how we display Jiro's engineering curiosity through you eat mackerel to look at the bones.
Also, that is like my worst nightmare. It's just, like, anytime I find like a bone in a fish that I'm eating, I'm instantly like, I can't eat the rest of this fish because I will die.
Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah,
Jiro loves it. He wants it.
Well, he
wants
have
to
all
choke and die.
Yeah, he wants to choke and die. That's so terrible. This is a different element.
This was before he met his wife, Dylan.
Oh,
you don't know.
fair.
He doesn't want to die yet.
Yeah, he seems to still be fascinated with, and the implication is the design of the mackerel bones inspires him to make the Zero at the end. I think it's a good.
It's cute, but I'm like, okay, is that accurate at all?
It's probably not. Honestly, I mean, you have to keep in mind with movies like this is a movie about a science person made by art people. So it's like, what? How are we going to display the scientific curiosity in a thematically resonant way?
I love that description.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing with all like movies of historical science people is they're made by artists, right?
But sometimes they do get like science people on board for like accuracy writing and stuff. And with this, it's like, I don't think they had that.
Probably not. Yeah, I would assume. I bet the math calculations and stuff, or they make
I'm
sure
sure
those are
that's
accurate. Yeah,
at least to some extent.
But yeah, it's definitely a simplifying of his inspiration and curiosity. But also, I do think like engineering can be viewed as a very artistic profession, and that ties into
Jiro's feelings about creating airplanes.
Yeah, creating and so I think that Miyazaki does, as we mentioned, tie in a lot to that with his own sees himself. I think is a lot with what Jiro's going through, even if it's a more scientific oriented thing that Jiro's doing, more artistically oriented that he's doing. I feel like we covered most of the big scenes here. Yeah.
Yep.
I think we have everything here. Aly, any other aspects to touch on of Wind Rises, or any final comments?
I'm trying to think if we did miss anything. No, I mean, I think we pretty much covered it. I think echoing basically the whole thing, it's a hard movie to watch, but it's very, very well done. I think you can appreciate it for what it is and still criticize it. I don't know if I'd say it's my least favorite movie to watch, just because I think, like, in terms of animation, I'm a visual person. I like just looking at pretty things, and it's just easy in that sense. But I don't know. It's not my favorite, not my least favorite, but I still think it's a good movie.
Yeah, nice. April, final comments?
Yeah, I agree with Aly that it's definitely a good movie, and you can definitely appreciate it for what it is. I mean, it does look beautiful. The music's very captivating, and so it has all of these like really great elements. But I agree that I think because of the uneasiness that it gives me, it makes it like hard to be like, this is my favorite movie ever, like everyone should watch it. I mean, I would definitely recommend this movie to other people, but I think I would probably like forewarn them and just be like, hey, just this movie's unsettling a little bit.
Lots of trigger warnings.
Yeah, but it's a great movie, like it really is. But again, it's just not my favorite, and I think a lot of that comes from like the context of the story.
Yeah. I will say that, like, in terms of Miyazaki or Ghibli in general, I think a lot of people #sleep on like the non-fantasy movies. So this one is also one that I would like really push people to watch, like up there with Poppy Hill and when not Wind Rises, Whisper of the Heart.
Yeah, it's a good point that there aren't the most watched of films. A lot of the non-fantasy ones, you could tie that into this. I think like we covered a lot of ways which this is an incredibly well-made, very good film. I think I'm probably going to come out of this because this concludes the Miyazaki portion of the rewatch. I'll probably come out of this as my least favorite Miyazaki film. But that being said, I think it's tremendous. So like, I don't think that and he made a single film, which is, even good. I think all of his films are excellent, incredible. I think this is one of them. Should be noted, as we are not the highest group on this movie, there are people that think of this as a masterpiece, this movie. Mm-hmm. I'll highlight critic David Elric, who called this the greatest animated movie ever made.
Okay, that's a stretch, I would think. But
I think probably there's not people really claiming that for Ponyo or...
The greatest animated movie ever made is Shrek 2, and I will stand by that.
Come on. But ignoring the Shrek movie is the masterpiece.
No, don't ignore the Shrek movie.
I think like you won't hear this about a lot of his other movies outside of
That's true, yeah.
the Spirited Aways and the Mononokes, but this is a movie that is certainly revered by some people. I do want to acknowledge that opinion for sure. And I think like
justified, like absolutely.
Yeah.
If what you like is what this movie is going for, because it's going for a lot of distinct things from other Miyazaki movies, I can clearly see why you would like this the most. If not, and in terms of this being the best, there's a ton of great stuff here. So I don't think it's like personally I don't agree, but I think it's I think you can easily justify it.
It's not a far-fetched idea.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but I like fantasy stuff, so
yeah. I mean,
I'm
fair.
Just like
and that
of
is
all
Miyazaki's
time, what is the greatest? No, Spider-Verse is the greatest animated movie of all time.
No, as I said in this series, I think Spirited Away is the greatest animated movie ever made.
Good.
So it's this is another Miyazaki film. So for me, like I think there's a tier of movie which I think is like a step behind all of other Miyazaki's other movies, which include these last three ones and probably Cagliostro as kind of being just a step behind his other films. But I don't view it as a thing where these are like so much worse than the others. I think you could easily just say any of them are as good as all of his others / even the best ones. I think he's just has so many different incredible movies of doing a lot of different things, which Wind Rises is most distinctive among them. And I certainly think we've acknowledged how notable and interesting its distinctiveness is, and its kind of well-made nature. So I think let us know your thoughts on Wind Rises. Find all the ways to contact us at overlyanimated.com. We are going to continue. The last Miyazaki movie we'll be covering on the series, but not the last Ghibli movie. So we have 2 more to go, including Takahata's final film, which I am extremely excited to talk about next time and rewatch that as we'll see if we compare it to this movie. Maybe an epic like this movie, a personal epic. It's kind of what I remember. So very excited to get into that movie. Make sure you can, again, overlyanimated.com to find everything about us, and find our Patreon at patreon.com/overlyanimated. Thanks to all of our current patrons, especially our patron of the podcast, Michael, and thanks to our straight patron executive producers Ryan, Steve, Alex, Beatrice, Hugh, Michael, Needle, and Phoenician. So we will see you next time for Tale of Princess Kaguya. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.
Bye.